264 BC. In the dust of the ruined streets of Messana, modern-day Messina in northeastern Sicily, an old blacksmith casts one last glance at his anvil, flipped over in the ashes. Smoke billows over the city, swords clash in the distance, and the wind carries the smell of burning oil and charred wood. Right here, amid the ruins of the trading port, where just yesterday they were loading up olive oil and grain, the greatest showdown of the ancient world kicks off. A series of conflicts that will decide which civilization gets to rule the Mediterranean. Two cities, two empires. One will survive. The other will disappear forever. 3 Punic Wars lasted 118 years, longer than such states as Israel or Ireland exist today. Whole generations were born, lived, and died without knowing peace outside the shadow of this conflict. It was not just a series of battles, it was an era that hardened Rome and destroyed Carthage. But who were these two rivals, ready to enter a deadly struggle? By 264 BC, Rome was already a powerful state on the Apennine Peninsula, a republic built on iron discipline, civic duty, and military valor. Its legions had conquered almost all of Italy, but the sea remained an alien element to it. Rome had no fleet, knew no naval tactics, did not control distant trade routes. It was a land power stubborn, methodical, growing from within. Carthage was completely different. Founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre around 814 BC, it grew from a trading outpost into one of the richest empires of the ancient world. Located on the coast of modern Tunisia, Carthage controlled key sea routes between the east and west of the Mediterranean, from Gibraltar to Libya, from Sardinia to Sicily. Its ships sailed to Britain and West Africa, bringing tin, silver, ivory, and slaves. Carthage did not conquer lands for glory. It bought influence, built trading posts, hired armies. Its wealth was based not on land, but on the sea. Not on citizen soldiers, but on merchants, bankers, and mercenaries. By the beginning of the war, it was already an old, experienced power confident in its superiority, but internally vulnerable. Its army depended on payment, and the loyalty of allies on profit. It was this confrontation of two worlds, Roman land and Carthaginian sea, republican valor and commercial pragmatism, that was to be decided in the fire of the First Punic War. Everything began not with a battle of legions or the storming of fortresses, but with betrayal. A handful of mercenary bandits, calling themselves Mamertines, from the Latin Mamertini, people of Mars, captured Messana, a city on the northeastern cape of Sicily, where Italy almost touches the island. To save themselves from the local tyrant, they appealed now to Rome, now to Carthage, like a gambler throwing dice in the hope that at least one side would save him. But their duplicity became the spark in the powder keg. Rome and Carthage had already been dividing the sea, trade, and influence for decades, maintaining a fragile balance. Now this balance was broken. And when Roman legionaries first set foot on Sicilian soil, they did not just come to help, they violated a sacred treaty. War became inevitable. Not for glory, not for gods, but to decide whose civilization is worthy of the future. For an ordinary resident of Messana, everything began not with politics, but with noise. First screams in the square, then the clanging of swords in narrow alleys, then the smell of smoke from burned houses. Women hid children in cellars. Men rushed between the fear of being captured by the Mamertines and the hope of salvation, whether from the Romans or the Carthaginians. No one knew then that this chaos would become the prologue to 3 decades of war that would change the fate of the entire Mediterranean. The Roman side initially rejected the requests of the Mamertines, fearing involvement in a complex local conflict. However, when it became obvious that Hieron II, the tyrant of Syracuse and one of the most influential rulers of Sicily, could completely subjugate Messana, the Roman command decided to act. Rome's intervention in Messana became a direct violation of one of the oldest treaties between the two republics, regulating their spheres of influence. This diplomatic failure, caused by the pursuit of gain, inevitably led to a clash. Carthaginian envoys demanded explanations from the Roman Senate, pointing to the violation of the sacred treaty. However, the Roman government, seeing an opportunity to expand its influence, turned a blind eye to the legal aspect and bet on military power. The Roman intervention became a direct invasion into what Carthage considered its sphere of influence, which became the formal reason for the start of the First Punic War. The First Punic War was a unique conflict because neither side was a naval power in the full sense of the word. Rome, being a great land power, possessed only a small floating fleet consisting of fishing boats, while Carthage, founded by descendants of Phoenician colonists, was the most powerful maritime trading and military center of its time. The conflict unfolded in all directions, on land in Sicily, at sea, and even in northern Italy. For a Roman farmer legionary called to service, this meant seeing the sea for the first time in his life, and immediately finding himself on the deck of a ship rocking in a storm. He did not know how to swim, did not know how to hold an oar, but he had to fight. For a Carthaginian sailor, raised amid salty wind and sails, the Romans seemed like savages, rude, stubborn, but frighteningly persistent. Voice from the past. In 256 BC, after the battle at Cape Ecnomus, hundreds of bodies were washed ashore in Sicily. One woman searched for her husband among the dead for a week. She found only his belt with his name engraved on copper. She hung it over the entrance to the house and never went outside again. For Rome, the war became a test of strength. For the first time in its history, the Republic faced the need to finance an expensive naval war, which required new mechanisms for collecting funds, in particular, increasing taxes on citizens. This marked the beginning of the era of military economy, when state expenditures on military needs began to have a serious impact on the country's financial system. The indemnity later imposed on Carthage amounted to 3,200 talents of silver, equivalent to several $1 billion in today's terms. This was not just payment for defeat, but economic strangulation designed for years. However, Rome's real breakthrough was its ability for rapid adaptation and innovation. Angered by defeats at sea, The Republic quickly copied one of the sunken Carthaginian ships and developed the so-called corvus, a special device that allowed Roman soldiers to jump onto enemy ships and engage in hand-to-hand combat, where Roman discipline and combat experience gave a decisive advantage. As a result of this innovation, Rome was able to win several important naval battles and accumulate victories that ultimately led to the decisive event of the war, the battle at the Aegates Islands in 241 BC. In this clash, the Roman fleet under the command of Gaius Lutatius Catullus, one of the first Roman admirals whose name is forever inscribed in the annals of naval history, completely defeated the Carthaginian fleet, depriving it of control over the sea and blocking Carthage's supply routes. The defeat at sea was fatal. Carthage, deprived of the ability to receive food and reinforcements, was forced to sue for peace. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC with the signing of the Lutatius Peace. The terms of this treaty were harsh for Carthage. It was obliged to pay a huge indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, which had to be paid over 10 years, to renounce all territories on the island of Sicily and its nearby islands, effectively depriving itself of its main source of income and a vital strategic frontier, to release all Roman prisoners of war without ransom, and to cease any military activity in Sicily without Rome's consent. The new terms of the treaty, imposed by Rome in 237 BC, further aggravated Carthage's position by annexing Sardinia and Corsica to Rome. These territories also became sources of new taxes for the Roman treasury. Thus, the First Punic War not only shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean, but also laid the foundation for future conflicts. It showed two key traits of the future opponents: Rome's ability for adaptation, technological and organizational innovations, as well as Carthage's economic power, which, even after defeat, retained the potential for revival. However, the most profound consequences of the war were the socio-economic changes within the Roman Republic itself. Prolonged and frequent military campaigns began to destroy the middle class of farmer soldiers, which formed the core of Roman society. The need to be constantly on campaigns led to many farmers being unable to tend their lands, which were either abandoned or absorbed by large landowners. This led to the formation of a mass class of landless people in the cities, which became one of the hidden drivers of further Roman expansion to provide land and work for its soldiers. Thus, although Rome triumphed on the battlefield, its own society was already beginning to crack at the seams, preparing for deeper internal upheavals in the future. The first years after the end of the First Punic War created the appearance of peace, but beneath the calm surface, a new, even more destructive strife was brewing. For Rome, which gained control over Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, as well as a huge indemnity, this victory meant not only territorial expansion, but also a new stage of economic development and military expansion. However, for Carthage, the defeat was a blow to its very existence. The burden of the indemnity, requiring annual payments over 10 years, paralyzed the economy and caused internal unrest. Nevertheless, Despite the hard times, the Carthaginian system demonstrated remarkable resilience. After the indemnity was paid, the country began the process of recovery, but now it was blinded by fear of Rome's power and the desire to regain lost positions. Sources show that subsequent rulers of Carthage tried in every way to appease Rome, but as a rule, they did not understand that any attempt to expand their influence would be perceived by the Roman Senate as a direct threat. This blindness in international relations, based on underestimating Roman ambition, became one of the key reasons for the inevitability of the next war. During this period, a key role in shaping the new Carthaginian strategy was played by one of the greatest commanders of the ancient world, Hamilcar Barca, father of the famous Hannibal and founder of the powerful military dynasty of the Barcids. After the end of the First War, he gained power over Carthage's western territories in Spain, from Gibraltar to the Guadalquivir River, and began purposeful work there to create a new empire parallel to the native one. His project, known as the Barcid Empire, was aimed at creating a powerful economic and military potential capable of opposing Rome. Hamilcar's main achievement was the conquest of the richest silver mines in southern Spain. This resource allowed Carthage not only to restore its economy, but also, more importantly, to finance a powerful and well-equipped army. The army created by Hamilcar consisted mainly of mercenaries recruited from various Iberian tribes, which was a characteristic feature of Carthaginian military affairs. For an Iberian warrior, service with the Carthaginians was not a duty but an opportunity to get money, weapons, glory. He knew neither Latin nor Punic, but he knew how to throw a javelin and swing a sword. It was this army, formed and trained by Hamilcar, that later became the basis for the campaigns of his successors and son Hannibal. Hamilcar's project is the story of surgically precise preparation for a future war, conducted bypassing official treaties and right under Rome's nose. Story of one man, in 221 BC, in a Carthaginian camp near New Carthage, modern Cartagena in Spain, an Iberian named Lucan received payment for a month of service, a sack of wheat and a copper coin. He sent everything home to the mountains. A week later, he went missing during the assault on a fortress. His family never learned whether he died as a hero or fled. After Hamilcar's death in 228 BC, command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and then to his son Hannibal, who continued his policy of expansion in Spain. However, the Roman government increasingly expressed dissatisfaction with this process, seeing it as a violation of treaty obligations. In the Roman Senate, anti-Carthaginian rhetoric intensified, and many politicians began to portray Carthage as an eternal threat. One of the most ardent propagandists of this idea was Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, an influential senator whose speeches in the Senate became a symbol of Roman foreign policy of those years. He repeatedly declared that Carthage, even disarmed, posed a constant threat, and that any restoration of it must be immediately suppressed. This thought, repeated many times, shaped in the minds of the Roman elite the image of Carthage as an eternal enemy. The culmination of this period of tension was the event that historians have always called the formal cause of the Second Punic War. In 219 BC, Hannibal, son of Hamilcar, commander of the Carthaginian troops in Spain, besieged and captured the city of Saguntum, located in southern Iberia, in the modern province of Valencia, Spain. This city was a Roman ally, and its protection was guaranteed by an agreement between Rome and Carthage, signed after the First War. When the besieged residents of Saguntum appealed for help to the Roman Senate, it sent 2 commissioners to Carthage with a demand to immediately cease the siege and return the city to the Romans. Hannibal, seeing that the siege would be lifted by Roman forces, decided to take the risk and continued the attack. Saguntum fell after a 2-month siege, and its population was either scattered or taken captive. After that, Hannibal began his march to Italy, bypassing Roman territories in Spain, which was an unimaginable challenge. Hannibal's march through the Alps is not just an ancient legend. It is a logistical nightmare comparable to modern operations in the Himalayas or Hindu Kush. No maps, no communication, no supply bases. Only man, mountains, and determination. Today, military historians still argue about which exact pass he used. The conditions were so harsh. And he also had elephants. Face of war. In 218 BC, 2 soldiers came to the house of one Roman craftsman. They did not bring the body of his son, too many dead at Cana. Only his sandal. The mother kept it under her pillow for the rest of her life. The Roman Senate, receiving news of the fall of Saguntum and Hannibal's decision, was shocked. The Senate demanded that Carthage immediately surrender Hannibal to Roman custody as the culprit of the war, and pay a new indemnity for violating the treaty. The Carthaginian Senate, not wanting war but feeling deceived and restricted, refused to surrender Hannibal, stating that he had acted without the government's knowledge. This decision became the signal for the start of the Second Punic War. What if the Romans had accepted a compromise? What if Hannibal had retreated? But history does not tolerate subjunctives. For contemporaries and for historical memory, it was the fall of Saguntum that became the landmark event, a symbol that treaties between equals no longer exist, and that the choice is between submission and war. This moment marked the transition from diplomatic intrigues and economic competition to open military confrontation that would shake the entire world of its time. The Second Punic War became not just another conflict, but the greatest military catastrophe in Roman history and the highest manifestation of the genius of one of the ancient commanders, Hannibal Barca. The war began with a bold and almost insane in its scale strategic maneuver. Hannibal, instead of crossing the Alps, moved his army, including elephants, through the mountains toward Italy. This crossing became one of the most famous episodes in world history, a symbol of courage, leadership, and desperation. Hannibal's army, consisting mainly of mercenaries, passed through mountain passes in snowy winter, losing thousands of men, animals, and equipment. Elephants, accustomed to African heat, fell from the cold, their corpses freezing on the slopes. People chewed leather from shields to avoid starving. The smell of sweat, fear, and fatigue hung in the air. But thanks to exceptional command and will to victory, he managed to deliver the remnants of his troops to the Po Valley, stunning the Romans and opening a theater of military operations for Carthage right in the heart of the Republic. As soon as Hannibal emerged onto the plains of Italy, he immediately began to act. His goal was simple and straightforward: to achieve quick and devastating victories to break the will of the Roman people and Senate to resist. He managed to attract several Italic tribes dissatisfied with Roman rule to his side, which gave him additional forces and support. However, his main task remained to deliver such a crushing blow to Rome that would force it to capitulate. This task was accomplished in one of the most famous battles in history, the battle at Cannae in 216 BC. On the fields of Cannae, in the southern part of Apulia, between the Ofanto and Aufidus rivers, the Roman consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro assembled an army of about 80,000 men, one of the largest in the history of the Republic, and clashed with Hannibal's significantly smaller army. Hannibal's tactics in this battle became a model of military thought. He deliberately weakened the center of his ranks to lure the dense and heavily armed Roman legions into it. When the Romans deepened into the pincers, Hannibal ordered his best fighters from both flanks to close in, surrounding and squeezing the huge Roman army. The legionaries heard their shields cracking under pressure, the neighbor on the right choking on dust, the commander shouting an order, and then falling silent. The air was thick with sweat, dust, and tension. Some soldiers fell not from wounds, but from suffocation in their own armor, squeezed by thousands of bodies. As a result, one of the heaviest defeats in ancient history occurred. Almost the entire Roman army was destroyed. About 50–60,000 Romans died, and the number of prisoners reached 10–15,000. This was the most terrible catastrophe in Roman history. The field of Cannae became the cemetery of an entire generation, fathers, sons, brothers. Mourning was declared in Rome. Women wept in the streets. No one knew if the Republic would survive. After Cannae, Hannibal got a chance that could have ended the war. Rome was gripped by horror, many of its allies abandoned it, and Hannibal could have immediately marched on Rome itself. But he hesitated. This strategic blunder may have been his main mistake. What if he had moved on Rome immediately? The city, not yet strengthened as an empire, might have fallen. The history of the West might have taken a different path with Carthage, not Rome, as the center of civilization. But he did not go. Perhaps he underestimated the psychological resilience of the Roman political system, which, against all odds, continued to resist. Be that as it may, his missed chance after Cannae may have been more valuable than the one he missed after Lake Trasimene. Rome, though shaken, did not break. Instead of seeking a decisive battle, the Roman government chose a new, completely different strategy: a war of attrition. This strategy was led by experienced commanders who realized that Hannibal could not be fought head-on, but its main representative was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Abandoning direct confrontation with Hannibal in Italy, Scipio proposed a bold and daring plan to transfer the main Roman forces to Spain, from where Hannibal received his resources and reinforcements. In 205 BC, Scipio was elected consul, and his plan was approved. He conducted several successful campaigns in Spain, capturing key cities and depriving Hannibal of his base. Returning to Rome, Scipio received extraordinary power to prepare an expedition to Africa. His plan was brilliantly simple: to force Hannibal to return to Carthage to defend his homeland. This was a direct analog of what Hannibal had done to Rome, but in reverse. In 204 BC, Scipio crossed the Sicilian Strait with an army and landed on the shores of Africa. Hannibal was forced to return home immediately, leaving Italy. He tried to stop Scipio, but unsuccessfully. Both armies found themselves on Carthaginian territory, and the war moved to a new plane. Finally, in 202 BC, the decisive battle took place. The battle at Zama, 100 kilometers southwest of Carthage, in the steppes of Tunisia. This was a duel of two greatest commanders, in which each used tactics learned from the experience of previous years. Hannibal, facing an experienced opponent, again applied his favorite pincer, tactics. However, Scipio, having carefully studied its weaknesses, took appropriate measures. He strengthened the center and placed the best soldiers on the flanks, which allowed him to neutralize the main advantage of the Carthaginian system, the reserve. As a result, Scipio inflicted a decisive defeat on Hannibal. The defeat at Zama became the end of the Second Punic War. Carthage was completely disarmed, deprived of all its foreign possessions except a small piece of land in North Africa, and was forced to pay a new, even more oppressive indemnity. The Second Punic War left a deep and indelible mark on Italian soil. The main population was destroyed, and the lands devastated, which led to serious social changes. This war accelerated the processes begun by the First War and further strengthened the dependence of Roman economy on slave labor, which led to further impoverishment of free farmers. For Carthage, Zama meant the final destruction of its status as a great power. It was technically free, but economically and politically dependent on Rome. However, even in this state, it continued to prosper, which caused a new surge of fear and hatred in Rome, preparing the ground for the Third, final war. The Third Punic War represents one of the most tragic and dramatic chapters in ancient history. If the first two wars were the result of real military and economic competition, then this war became a product of political ideological fanaticism and deeply rooted fear in the heart of the Roman Republic. After the defeat at Zama, Carthage, although disarmed and deprived of any foreign policy, remained a living organism. Its trade and population quickly recovered, and it again became a prosperous trading center, attracting the attention of neighboring peoples, especially the king of Numidia, first Messana, and then his successors, whose raids on Carthaginian lands became the pretext for a new catastrophe. This fact caused feelings of anxiety and hatred in Rome. The existence of a prosperous neighbor capable of becoming a competitor again was unbearable for the Roman Senate. which had long decided on the complete and final destruction of Carthage. The central figure driving the policy of destruction was Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, a Roman consul, historian, and one of the most influential orators of his time. His life was dedicated to one idea, which he turned into a mantra: Carthage must be destroyed. This phrase, repeated by him for decades, became a symbol of Roman collective unconscious fear of a rival who, in the opinion of some Roman politicians, posed a threat to the Republic itself. Although some historians believe that this was rather populist rhetoric to strengthen his own power than a real threat, one cannot discount the deep psychological impact of this idea. Any aspiration of Carthage for prosperity was perceived as a threat, and any of its diplomatic initiatives as a conspiracy. This fear, fueled for years, became the driving force of the Third War, which was not so much a necessity as an ideological dogma. The formal pretext for the start of the war was a formal violation of the treaty. In 150 BC, the Carthaginian government, succumbing to pressure from the neighboring kingdom of Numidia, which constantly invaded their territory, decided to arm itself for self-defense. This decision was made by the majority of the Carthaginian people, but it violated the condition of the treaty after Zama, which prohibited Carthage from having an army or producing weapons without Rome's prior consent. The Roman Senate immediately perceived this as a pretext for war. Carthaginian envoys were sent to Rome to justify themselves, but the Roman government was adamant. In 149 BC, the Roman Senate sent a new emissary to Carthage, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the future destroyer of Carthage and consul whose name is forever associated with its fall, with a demand that the inhabitants of Carthage leave their city and resettle inland, away from the coast. This demand was unfeasible and absolutely inhumane. The Carthaginians, seeing that peace was impossible, unanimously rejected this proposal. They preferred to fight for their homeland rather than become refugees. The war began. However, this was not a war of equal forces. The Third Punic War was short and one-sided. The Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, landing in Africa, quickly surrounded Carthage and began the siege. The city, unable to produce weapons, barely fought back, using old Roman shields and weapons given to it after the First War. The siege lasted 3 years. The Carthaginians, unlike their predecessors, fought with desperate bravery, understanding that the fate of their city and culture depended on the outcome of this siege. They dismantled walls for soil to use it for strengthening defensive ramparts, and even, as reported, burned their houses to deprive the Romans of shelters. Life against the backdrop of empires. On one of the scorched clay shards found under the ruins of Carthage, an inscription in Punic has been preserved. We do not ask for mercy. We ask for memory. It was probably written by the last scribe of the city, a day before the assault. Finally, in 146 BC, the Romans breached the city walls. A 3-day looting and destruction began. Sources describe horrific scenes. Roman soldiers captured the city's inhabitants, taking them captive. All who did not die in battle or burn in houses were taken into slavery. Then the Romans burned the city to the ground, and then, according to legend, salted the earth so that no one could ever build a new city in this place. The Library of Carthage, containing priceless historical and literary monuments, was destroyed along with the city. We know about Carthage almost exclusively from Roman sources, the victors, who called it cruel, treacherous, barbaric. But what if its own books had survived? Its laws, its maps of sea routes. Perhaps we would see not Rome's enemy, but a rival, another model of civilization based on trade, not conquests. Archaeological studies of modern Carthage show that the Romans destroyed the city with such thoroughness that very few traces of its former greatness, which surpassed even Rome of that time, have survived. The destruction of Carthage became a symbol of cruelty and fear driven by Rome. Some researchers even call this event the first genocide in the modern sense of the word, emphasizing its purposeful and systematic character. Thus, the Third Punic War ended not so much with military success as with a political and ideological triumph of the Roman Senate. It demonstrated that for Rome, nothing is sacred, neither treaties, nor human lives, nor cultural heritage, if it hinders the achievement of the main goal: absolute dominance in the Mediterranean. The Punic Wars had a deep and multifaceted influence on the entire Mediterranean world, reformatting its geopolitical landscape and leaving an indelible mark on the social and economic structures of both warring powers. For Rome, these wars became the path to unprecedented power, but also the beginning of a process of internal transformation that ultimately led to the crisis of the Republic. For Carthage, they meant complete and final destruction, turning a former equal partner into ashes, symbolizing Rome's absolute power. The socioeconomic consequences for Rome were fundamental. The First Punic War had already laid the foundation for changes, destroying the middle class of farmer soldiers who could not combine farming with prolonged and frequent campaigns. The Punic Wars, especially the second, only accelerated this process. Huge armies requiring constant service led to a mass exodus of population from villages to cities, which created the problem of landless and unemployed citizens in Rome. These people, having no income of their own, became an easily manageable mass that political leaders could rely on by offering them free food aid and land outside Italy. This led to an increase in social inequality and exacerbation of the conflict between the Senate, representing noble landowners, and the popular tribunes defending the interests of the common people. In addition, the wars led to a massive influx of slaves from conquered territories, which further cheapened slave labor and made it the basis of the Roman economy, especially in agriculture. This, in turn, contributed to the further decline of small farming households. Economically, Rome became an immensely wealthy state. The conquest of Sicily, Spain, Corsica, Sardinia, and subsequent territories in Greece and Asia Minor brought colossal riches to the Roman Republic in the form of tribute, slaves, and new markets. The increase in taxes and new sources of income allowed the state to finance not only military campaigns, but also large-scale construction projects, improving the quality of life in Rome itself. However, this growth was uneven and led to the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of a small circle of aristocrats who controlled republican institutions. Thus, the Punic Wars, becoming a catalyst for Roman expansion, at the same time sowed the seeds of the future crisis of the republican system. For Carthage, the consequences were even more tragic. The First War led to the loss of its main source of income, Sicily, as well as the need to pay a huge indemnity. The Second War finally destroyed its status as a great power, depriving it of all foreign possessions and leaving only a small piece of land in North Africa. The Third War led to complete and final destruction. Carthage, once the richest and most prosperous trading center in the world, was erased from the face of the earth. Its population was scattered or taken into slavery, and its culture and language were practically erased. This was not just a military defeat, but an act of complete ethnic and cultural destruction, comparable to what happened to the cities of Corinth and Numantia. The destruction of Carthage became a powerful message to all other peoples and states under Roman rule. Resistance was useless, and the only alternative to submission is complete destruction. Geopolitically, the Punic Wars led to the Roman Republic becoming the sole hegemon in the Mediterranean. After 146 BC, no force remained capable of opposing it. This opened the way for Rome's further expansion eastward, to Greece and Asia Minor, and ultimately to the transformation of the Republic into an empire. However, this absolute triumph also laid the foundation for future problems. Power concentrated in the hands of one person, and the constant need for military generals to protect the Republic's borders led to the growth of personal power of commanders, which ultimately led to civil wars and the fall of the Republic under Augustus. In the end, the three Punic Wars are not just the history of three military conflicts, but an entire era that defined the future of the Western world. This is a story about how the slightest mistake in diplomacy can lead to a century-long war, how the genius of one man can bring the greatest power to its knees, and how fear and hatred can lead to the commission of the most cruel and ruthless act of destruction. Today, olives grow on the site of Carthage. Tourists take pictures of the ruins, not knowing that under their feet is the ash of a city that dared to challenge Rome. But it was this challenge, this 3-century struggle, that hardened the Roman Republic, and at the same time sowed the seeds of its demise. Victory over Carthage gave Rome peace, but deprived it of purpose. And an empire without an enemy is like a ship without wind.